Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere a little unusual. Not a palace, not a battlefield, but a tiny workshop at the edge of old Paris, where time itself used to whisper. You'll step through sawdust and oil, between clocks that seem to breathe. Each tick and tock folds into the next like quiet waves on an unseen shore. And somewhere in the middle of all that sound, there's a silence so deep you could drown in it. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes here. The air smells like brass and insomnia. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open the door, and a faint chime welcomes you, not from a bell, but from a gear brushing against another, tired of keeping time. The room is half dark, the windows painted with the weak gold of a Parisian midnight. Dust shimmers like lazy constellations in the lamplight. Everywhere you look there are clocks, hundreds, maybe thousands, stacked on shelves hanging from hooks, resting like metal birds asleep in their cages. They all tick, but never together. It's like a small orchestra that forgot the conductor. A pocket watch chatters too fast. A wall clock sighs every other second. Somewhere a pendulum gasps as it swings. A slow breath in and out. You take a step, and the floor creaks like an old violin. And then you see him, Étienne, the clockmaker. He's hunched over a workbench, his back curved like a question mark that's been asking for too long. His white sleeves are rolled to the elbows, showing arms speckled with burns and brass dust. He doesn't look up when you enter. Maybe he doesn't need to. Maybe he already knew you'd come. A magnifying lens glows over one eye, making him look like a one-eyed moth studying the moon. The smell of oil and candle wax sticks to your tongue. You feel the hum of every ticking thing as if time itself were vibrating beneath your ribs. He murmurs almost to himself. Do you hear it? You tilt your head. Hear what? The silence. It's funny, you almost laugh. The room is anything but silent. Every surface clicks, wheezes, hums. The whole space sounds like a mechanical forest. But Étienne smiles faintly, like someone who's found the punchline to an old riddle. He dips a tiny brush into oil and lets a droplet fall into the brass heart of a clock. Most people think time lives in the ticking, he says softly. But the truth is, it hides in the pauses. The lamplight trembles, as if agreeing. Outside Paris breathes. Faint horse hooves, a distant laugh, the crackle of a gas lamp. Yet here, inside this little room, you feel like you've stepped outside of everything. Out of time, out of breath, you glance around. Some clocks have stopped mid-tick, their hands frozen between seconds. Others whirl uncontrollably, spinning hours into nonsense. There's a beautiful one by the window, its casing carved like a cathedral spire. But when you lean closer, you realize it's not ticking at all. Instead, you feel a faint pulse in the air beside it, like something alive but inaudible. Étienne notices your curiosity. That one doesn't measure seconds, he says. It measures the space between them. You blink. You mean silence? He chuckles, the soft kind of laugh people make when they know something you don't. Yes, or maybe something smaller, a silence so thin it slices time apart. He lifts the clock's glass cover and lets you see the inside. No gears, no pendulum, only a single silver wire coiled like a sleeping snake. I've been chasing this silence for years, he admits. Every time I think I've caught it, it slips away. Like a whisper hiding behind another whisper. His voice drops lower and the air seems to follow. You hear your own breath louder than the clock's now. You realize this isn't about sound, it's about presence, about noticing what isn't there. You sit, uninvited but welcome, on a stool nearby. The bench is warm from the lamp. Étienne continues working, polishing a piece so small it might be imaginary. He tells you stories in fragments, how he started making clocks for nobles who wanted to own time, how the city's noise grew until he couldn't think, how one day, after a long night, his favorite clock stopped ticking, and he realized he liked it better that way. He laughs at himself. Maybe I'm just a fool who's tired of sound. Maybe I want to prove that silence moves too. You grin. You know, in the 21st century we call that burnout. Étienne doesn't understand the reference, but he catches the tone. Ah yes, burnout. A candle melting too fast, yes? You nod. He nods back as if you've just agreed on something profoundly human. From somewhere behind you, a clock strikes 12. Not loudly, and just a soft metallic ting. Then another joins. And another. Until the whole workshop fills with the echo of midnight, overlapping, imperfect, beautiful. When the last note fades, there's a moment of total stillness. Étienne closes his eyes. You do too. And for the first time you realize what he means. The silence after the sound isn't empty. It's alive. It breathes. You almost whisper, it's still there. He smiles, eyes still closed. Yes, that's what I measure. There's something comforting about the absurdity of it. A man trying to weigh silence as if the universe could be wound like a spring. You imagine his friends teasing him, the neighbors thinking he's mad. But somehow you believe him. You can feel the silence weighing on your skin, soft and dense as velvet. He opens his eyes again, studies you. You hear too, don't you? You nod, and in that moment he looks relieved. Not proud, just peaceful, like someone who's finally been understood. He returns to his bench. The lamplight flickers. Outside, the moon climbs a little higher over Paris, silvering the rooftops. Somewhere in the city, a dog barks. Somewhere else, a lover sighs. But here, inside this forgotten room, time stretches thin and fragile. Étienne winds a clock that isn't ticking. They all measure movement, he says softly. But I want one that measures stillness. You think about your phone, the endless notifications, the noise of living too fast. And for a moment, you envy him. His world may be smaller, but it listens better. He gestures toward the shelves. Choose one, he says. Just for tonight. You reach for the smallest clock, copper, dented, warm to the touch. When you hold it up to your ear, you hear nothing. No tick, no hum, just quiet. Étienne smiles again. Good, you found it. He turns away, back to his tools. You stand there, holding silence in your hands, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, this is what time sounds like when it finally rests. The oil lamp trembles one last time before the flame settles. A faint breeze sneaks through the window, carrying the scent of rain. The workshop sighs, alive and sleeping all at once. And as you breathe in that quiet air, you realize maybe measuring silence isn't madness. Maybe it's mercy. You stand there, still hearing the fading heartbeat of the workshop, that slow, uncertain rhythm of gears that seem to breathe between each tiny click. The scent of metal polish and old oil lingers, sharp but strangely comforting, like a library that learned to hum. A man emerges from the far side of the room, where candlelight trembles against shelves stacked with brass wheels and coiled springs. His hair is streaked silver, tied back loosely, and his eyes are the calmest part of the night. That's Étienne Lenoir, the man who tried to measure silence. He doesn't look like an inventor in a painting, all posture and pride, more like someone who forgot what sleep feels like. His shirt sleeves are rolled to the elbow, forearms stained with grease and fine scratches from gears that refuse to obey. You're here for the noise, he says softly, his voice carrying an accent that folds vowels into silk. But it's the spaces between that matter. You don't reply, maybe because it feels wrong to break the spell. Every object in his workshop seems to listen, waiting for your voice, the way a cat might pause before a pounce. Étienne moves toward the bench, brushes aside a scattering of tiny screws, and you notice how his hands hesitate just above them, as though afraid to disturb their rest. Do you know, he begins, tightening a screw no larger than a freckle, that clocks were once made to echo the heartbeat of their maker. He smiles faintly. A balance wheel swings like a pulse, a pendulum like breath. The statement feels poetic, maybe too poetic, and yet you sense he means it literally. There's something intimate in the way he touches the metal, like a man tuning a living thing. Étienne tells you he was born in Lyon in 1820, in a small flat above a tannery where the smell of animal skin never left the air. His father made pocket watches that ticked louder than any sermon, because, as his father claimed, people trust what they can hear. But Étienne was the kind of boy who leaned closer to the moments when the ticking stopped. He'd sit for hours, listening to the brief hush between seconds, wondering if time paused too, just for him. It was, in his words, the first time he fell in love with nothing. When he turned 20, he moved to Paris, because, as he said with a chuckle, every dream needs both an audience and bad coffee. You can almost see him, a young man with soot under his nails, crossing the Pont Neuf at dawn, listening to the bells announcing the city's heartbeat. They say the 19th century was the age of progress, he murmurs, adjusting a gear's tooth with a tiny file. But progress sounds awfully loud, doesn't it? He gestures toward the window. And though you only hear the faint murmur of carriages and rain, you imagine the noise of his time, factories churning, engines coughing, horses clattering, men shouting over the clang of steel. The world, Étienne says, began to worship sound. The ringing of telegraphs, the whistles of locomotives, the booming speeches in public squares. Silence, he says, became a luxury, rarer than gold, more fragile than glass. He once tried to escape it, he tells you, traveling to the countryside to find quiet. But even there, the wind made its own kind of chatter, and birds refused to cooperate. I realized, he says, that silence isn't the absence of noise. It's the presence of attention. You laugh quietly and he smiles, as though that was the reaction he hoped for. If I'd said that at the academy, he adds, they'd have written it down as nonsense. But nonsense sometimes knows the truth first. He turns to a sketch pinned on the wall, a strange design, part clock, part mirror. The drawing shows a circular mechanism surrounded by markings but no numbers. At the center is a pendulum, drawn not as a rod but as a line fading to nothing. That's my quiet clock, he says, the one I still don't understand. You lean closer. How can a clock tell time, you ask, without making sound? Étienne chuckles, a low, weary sound that feels like a sigh shared by centuries. Ah, that is the question. It cannot, at least not in the way we think. A clock measures motion. But what if you measured the stillness between motions? It's a strange thought, to measure nothing. And yet, something about it feels deeply human. You think about how people today measure silence too. Not with clocks, but with noise-canceling headphones, meditation apps, or just the moment they realize the Wi-Fi stopped working. Silence still hides between interruptions. Étienne returns to his workbench, winding a pocket watch whose ticking sounds like a polite apology for existing. I used to think silence would comfort me, he says, but the truth is it frightened me. The first time I turned off all my clocks, I could hear my own blood. That's not peace, and that's panic dressed as calm, you grin. So you were scared of silence? He lifts a brow. Of course. Anyone who says otherwise is lying or deaf. You can't help but laugh, though quietly, because laughter feels too loud in this room. For a moment, Étienne's expression softens. He tells you about nights when he worked until dawn, building clocks for the wealthy. Some shaped like miniature cathedrals, others like gilded cages. He once made one that chirped like a bird every hour, but the buyer complained that it woke his real parrot. You see, he says, people want to control time, but not to hear it. They love the tick only when it belongs to someone else's clock. He pauses, gazing at his hands, the fingers trembling slightly from years of precision. I began to wonder if silence had its own rhythm, not measured in seconds, but in breaths. You glance around the room at hundreds of clocks frozen at different hours, as if time itself had splintered and settled here. The candles have burned low, their wax forming rivers over brass. Outside, the rain softens to drizzle. The world seems to match his words, every drop landing a little slower, the air stretching like a long-held note. Étienne looks up, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and wonder. They think I build clocks, he whispers, but really I build mirrors. Every tick tells you what you've lost. Every pause tells you what remains. You realize, as he leans back in his chair, that you've been holding your breath for longer than you thought. Maybe this is what he meant. Silence not as void, but as the space where attention finally catches up with time. He takes off his spectacles, rubs his eyes, and sets a watch down on the table. It stops ticking. He doesn't even flinch. Sometimes, he says, almost to himself, you have to stop listening to hear what matters. You wonder what he means, but before you can ask, the workshop light flickers. The flame steadies again, but for that single heartbeat you hear it. The absence, the clean, endless hum of nothing. Étienne smiles faintly, as though you've both just discovered something secret. The night deepens. The clocks keep their counsel, and somewhere inside the rhythm of quiet, you start to understand why a man might spend a lifetime trying to measure what cannot be heard. Étienne leans closer to the workbench, the lamplight trembling across his face. You can tell he hasn't slept much. There's a faint dusting of soot on his cheek, and his eyes gleam with that fragile brightness that only appears when obsession replaces rest. The air in the workshop is thick with oil and brass filings. Yet beneath all the noise of the city, there's something almost reverent here, as if each gear and spring waits for his command. He's drawing again tonight, Long curves of graphite loop across the parchment, forming a design so elegant it seems alive. You see, he murmurs to you, everyone believes time moves forward because something ticks, a sound, a pulse. He looks up, his hands still. But what if it also moves when nothing happens at all? You tilt your head, trying to follow. He smiles, patient, kind, a little sad. I'm building a clock, he says, that will not speak. It will only listen. You almost laugh softly, partly because it sounds absurd, partly because you know he means it. A clock without sound? It's like inventing a candle that gives no light. Yet Étienne explains with the tenderness of a teacher that silence too can be measured if one understands how to read it. The world counts the beats, he says, but I want to count the pauses. Outside, Paris is wide awake. You can hear the wagons groaning across the cobblestones, the bells of the trams, a dog barking somewhere in Montmartre. The sounds layer like the pages of a book being turned too quickly. Étienne hardly notices. His hand moves again, quick, decisive, the outline of a pendulum that doesn't swing but breathes. He shows you a small cylinder of polished brass, the heart of his design. Inside, 2 plates of silver will face each other across an invisible space. Between them, he says, lies the secret, a chamber that listens instead of speaks. The still air trapped inside will respond to the faintest vibration. But what he truly seeks is when it does not. A moment so quiet, he whispers, that even air forgets to move. You can't help teasing him. And if it works, you ask, will you sell silence to Parisians by the ounce? Étienne laughs, the sound warm and brittle at once. No, he says, I only want to prove it exists. He tells you that since Galileo's time, men have measured motion, gravity, light, heat, everything but absence. No one, he claims, has ever captured nothingness. Maybe, he says, tapping the sketch, because everyone is afraid of it. You think about that. Maybe he's right. Silence is a strange kind of mirror. It shows you everything you've been avoiding. It makes you notice your heartbeat, your breath, the way your thoughts stumble when they have nowhere to hide. In this century of machines, silence feels almost unnatural, like a missing color in a bright painting. Étienne begins to assemble the prototype. His fingers are steady, precise, almost tender. Watching him work feels like watching someone conduct an orchestra you can't hear. Springs coil and uncoil, screws glint like tiny stars. You're amazed that something so small could possibly hold the weight of an idea this big. At one point, the lamplight flickers, and for a breath, just one, everything stills. The world pauses. You feel it too. The hum of the lamp, the distant rhythm of the city, your own pulse, all suspended, as if time itself has taken a breath. Then it passes and Étienne looks up sharply. Did you feel that? He asks. You nod. He smiles faintly, almost triumphant. That, he says, is what I'm chasing. He goes on working through the night and you stay with him because leaving would feel like breaking a spell. Occasionally he mutters something. Fragments of equations, half-remembered Latin, maybe prayers. You lose track of the hours, lulled by the rhythm of his movements until dawn creeps through the shutters, pale and uncertain. On the table now sits something beautiful, a clock unlike any you've seen. Its case gleams with polished copper, but the face is empty, almost blank. Instead of hands, it bears a ring of small crystal beads that catch the morning light. There's a faint vibration deep inside, not ticking but breathing. Étienne wipes his hands on his apron. The dream, he says softly, is to make time visible, even when it doesn't speak. You ask how he'll know if it works. He shrugs gently. When it teaches me something I didn't build into it. He closes the glass lid, and the room grows eerily still. Even the usual murmurs of the workshop seem to withdraw. For a moment you wonder if perhaps it has already succeeded, if the silence now filling the room is not absence, but a presence so complete that sound dares not disturb it. Étienne watches the clock as if waiting for it to move. It doesn't. The beads shimmer faintly. You almost imagine them breathing, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the world. The air feels heavy but calm, the kind of silence that makes you want to whisper even your thoughts. Then, faintly, you hear a noise from outside. The chime of a passing carriage bell. Étienne exhales, disappointed but not defeated. Not yet, he says. He takes notes carefully, marking the reaction of the air, the temperature, even the vibration of your footsteps. His handwriting is a dance of patience, every letter deliberate, like someone trying to document a ghost. As the day unfolds, you both step outside. The sky above Paris has turned the color of pewter, heavy with the promise of rain. Étienne pulls his coat tighter, gazing toward the horizon where smokestacks blur into clouds. They say progress never sleeps, he murmurs, but perhaps that's the problem. You smile. You'd rather it nap occasionally? He chuckles. Just long enough for the world to hear itself again. Back inside, the rain begins to fall, slow, rhythmic, forgiving. Each drop against the window pane sounds like a reminder that even noise has patterns, and perhaps silence too has its own music. Étienne returns to his bench, retightens a gear, adjusts the angle of a spring, and you realize he's not building a clock at all. He's building a listener. You think of modern life, your phone buzzing, traffic humming, endless chatter filling every corner. If you could show Étienne your world, he'd probably faint on the spot. Or maybe he'd smile, reach for his sketches and say, "Yes, this is why I built it." Outside, thunder rolls faintly, swallowed by the city's heartbeats. Inside, a clock that refuses to tick, waits for its first true moment of silence. And you, watching him, listening to everything and nothing, start to understand that he isn't chasing quiet to escape the world. He's trying to remind it how to breathe. Somewhere beyond the rain, a factory whistle calls again, sharp and distant. Étienne doesn't flinch this time. His eyes stay fixed on the brass heart of his invention, gleaming faintly in the half-light, as if daring time itself to hush. The workshop smells faintly of oil and brass tonight, that soft metallic tang that clings to the air long after the last gear stops moving. You can almost taste it, like old coins on your tongue. Étienne leans over his workbench, the lamplight trembling across his face. The flame dances on his spectacles, and for a second, you could mistake him for some sort of priest, officiating not over a mass, but over the fragile ritual of machinery. You watch him hold a piece of brass between his fingers, small enough to disappear in your palm, yet somehow it feels alive. That's the heart of the new clock, the one that's supposed to breathe silence itself. He calls it le cœur en laiton, the brass heart. It's supposed to move with invisible rhythm, to beat in the quiet the way sound beats in noise. He adjusts a screw the size of an eyelash, inhales, and then flick. The pendulum trembles, hesitates, and then stops. The heart refuses to beat. Étienne exhales. Not in anger, not yet, but in something gentler, almost embarrassed. You can tell he's used to failure. He whispers to himself in that way inventors do, half mocking, half hoping. "Perhaps time simply doesn't trust me," he murmurs. You sit on a stool in the corner, the wood creaking beneath you. The workshop is a cave of ticking, except for this one stubborn device. Around it, other clocks mark time with perfect obedience. The wall clock's heartbeat steady, the pocket watches scattered on the bench like sleeping insects. But this one, it's still. Étienne watches the pendulum, waiting for it to resume. He refuses to intervene, as though afraid that touching it again might scare it further into silence. The only sound now is the hiss of his lamp and the faint wheeze of the Paris wind outside. You find yourself holding your breath too. It's funny, silence has gravity. Once it begins, you don't want to disturb it. When the pendulum finally twitches again, your heart jumps. It swings once, twice, and then halts, as if the very concept of continuation offends it. Étienne slumps back on his stool. "Well," he says, rubbing his face, "at least it's polite enough to tease me before it dies." You can't help but smile. There's humor even in defeat. He picks up a tiny screwdriver, the kind so delicate you imagine it could open the eyelid of a butterfly, and leans back over the brass heart. The lamplight pulls around him again, gold and trembling. He tightens one spring, then loosens another. The clock responds with a faint click, a sound almost shy. Étienne nods, satisfied. He winds the key and lets go. This time, the pendulum doesn't stop. It shivers just slightly, like it's gathering courage. The hands move forward a single minute, then pause again, frozen between intention and surrender. You lean closer. There's something eerie about a clock that wants to live but can't. Étienne sighs. Maybe time refuses to move without a voice, he says quietly. Maybe silence frightens it. That thought lingers in the air. You imagine time itself, not as a river or a line, but as a creature that listens for its own echo. Without sound, maybe it forgets it exists. Étienne writes something in his notebook, quick looping script. He notes the interval between ticks, even though the clock has failed again. To him, failure is still a measurement, He records it all, the tremor, the hesitation, the refusal. He's not building a timepiece anymore. He's building a confession. You glance around the room. It's crowded with ghosts of inventions. Old pendulums hang like dried vines. Shelves overflow with gears and half-assembled escapements, each one an unfinished thought. Somewhere under the table, a cat Étienne never officially owns curls into a nest of crumpled blueprints. You can hear it purring, a faint rhythmic counterpoint to the silence above. Do you ever think, Étienne says suddenly without looking up, that noise is just time reminding us it's alive? You chuckle softly. And silence, he smiles. Silence is when it holds its breath. That line hangs between you. It's beautiful and strange and just a little unsettling. You think of how many hours of your own life have been filled with background hum, city traffic, neighbors' footsteps, the buzz of your phone. Could you even survive total silence? Probably not. You'd start narrating your own thoughts just to make some sound. Étienne, though, he's comfortable in the stillness. He moves slowly, methodically. Every time he winds another spring, it's like he's taming a living thing. You can feel his obsession deepening, a quiet hunger that hums beneath his calm exterior. At one point, he closes his eyes and listens. Nothing. Then he whispers, "If there is a rhythm in nothingness, I'll find it." Outside, the night stretches over Paris. You can hear the faraway clatter of a carriage, the muffled laughter of people leaving a cafe. Life continues, noisy and indifferent. Inside this workshop, however, the world is paused. Étienne sets the failed clock aside and begins sketching a new design. His hands move quickly, confidently, as though guided by something unseen. You peek at the page, curves and spirals, a diagram of motion trying to capture stillness. He stops only to take a sip of black coffee that's gone cold hours ago. "You know," he says, glancing at you, "in music, rests are as important as notes. Perhaps time is the same. Perhaps I'm just composing a symphony you can't hear." You grin. "A silent symphony?" He nods. "The most honest kind." The two of you share a small laugh. The sound feels too loud in the workshop, like laughter in a library. Still, it feels good. The cat stirs, unimpressed. Étienne returns to his notes. His handwriting trails into the margin where he's written something almost like a prayer. Si le cœur ne bat pas, peut-être le silence respire à sa place. If the heart does not beat, perhaps silence breathes in its stead. There's something achingly human about that. You watch him until your eyes grow heavy. The lamplight flickers again, stretching the shadows across the floor like slow-moving waves. Somewhere in that golden dimness, you imagine time itself leaning against the doorframe, watching Étienne with curiosity, maybe amused, maybe afraid. When the flame finally sputters and dies, the last sound is the faint tap of a gear falling onto the table. Then, nothing. The deepest kind of nothing. The kind that feels full, not empty. You stay still. Étienne stays still. The workshop breathes once, quietly. The brass heart on the bench gleams dully in the moonlight. For a heartbeat. Or maybe you imagined it, you think it moves, but no. It's just your own pulse echoing in your ears, reminding you that even silence has rhythm, if you're patient enough to hear it. The next morning, light drips through the window like honey, thick and slow, dust caught inside it like floating specks of time. Étienne hasn't slept. You can tell from the way his shoulders hunch forward, the way his eyes move restlessly over his desk. The failed clock sits before him, half covered by a sheet of linen as if it were a patient that didn't make it through the night. He's been murmuring to himself again. Not prayers this time, but questions. Philosophical ones. You half expect him to start debating with the air. Then, as if summoned by that thought, someone knocks at the door. The knock isn't polite. It's deliberate, the kind that doesn't ask permission but demands presence. Étienne looks up, startled, then shrugs. "If it's another client asking for a louder chime," he mutters, "I might pretend I'm deaf." But when he opens the door, it's not a client. It's a man in a long coat, the color of drying ink. His hair is messy in that carefully careless way that only philosophers and poets can pull off. You can tell from the first glance, this isn't someone who buys clocks. This is someone who wants to argue about them. "Étienne Lenoir?" the man asks. His voice has that strange rhythm, half Parisian drawl, half classroom lecture. "Yes," Étienne answers cautiously. "I'm Julien Desmarais," the stranger says, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I've read your paper in Le Chronomètre Illustré, the one about the possibility of measuring silence." Étienne blinks. That wasn't supposed to be published, he whispers. Julien smiles. Oh, everything worth reading isn't supposed to be published. You can't help but grin. The philosopher looks around the workshop, running a gloved finger along a dusty shelf. It smells of thought in here, he says, and perhaps a little of failure. Étienne doesn't take the bait. He gestures to a chair. Sit then. What does a philosopher want with a man who measures absence? Julien sits. His movements are slow, almost theatrical. I want to ask, he says softly, whether silence exists at all. Étienne raises an eyebrow. Of course it does. You're sitting in it right now, Julien chuckles. Am I? Listen closely. For a moment the room goes quiet. You listen too. And he's right. It's not truly silent. There's the faint ticking from the other clocks. The sigh of the wind outside. Even the soft hum of Étienne's breath. Julien leans forward. You see, silence is an illusion. It's just a pause between noises. The ear invents it. Étienne tilts his head, considering. Then perhaps the illusion deserves its own measure. If silence doesn't exist, I want to know the shape of its lie. Julien laughs. That's a very French way to rebel against reality. They begin to talk, or rather to duel gently with words. You sit back, watching the exchange. Étienne speaks like a craftsman. His logic is tangible, made of brass and screws. Julien answers like a poet. His arguments are smoke and candlelight. Étienne insists that silence is the pulse between heartbeats, the invisible framework that gives rhythm meaning. Julien counters that silence is nothing but absence. An absence cannot be measured. What you call silence, Julien says, is merely the ghost of sound. And what you call sound, Étienne replies, is merely silence trying to escape itself. You stifle a laugh. It's like watching two swordsmen spar, except instead of blades, they're swinging metaphors. Julien grins. You know, Monsieur Lenoir, if you were born a century later, you'd be designing music for philosophers' cafes. And if you were born a century earlier, Étienne says, you'd be burned for talking too much. You can't help it, you laugh out loud. Étienne looks at you and smiles just briefly. The tension softens. Julien takes off his gloves, sets them aside. Tell me, he says, when you listen for silence, what do you actually hear? Étienne pause. At first, nothing. Then a faint vibration, like the room is breathing slower than me. It's not the absence of sound, it's something beneath it, as if the world hums even when it rests. Julien leans back, intrigued. The hum of existence. Perhaps, Étienne says, or perhaps it's just my heartbeat echoing back at me. Either way, it means silence has weight. If it has weight, it can be measured. The philosopher looks impressed or maybe envious. And yet if you measure it, you destroy it. The act of listening gives it sound, like observing light changes its nature. Étienne smiles faintly. Then I suppose I'll have to measure it without listening. Julien chuckles. Ah, the perfect paradox. A deaf clockmaker building a mute clock. You can tell he doesn't mean it cruelly. He's genuinely fascinated, the way only people addicted to thought can be. The two men continue for hours. They discuss Greek philosophers, Pythagoras, and the music of the spheres, and how perhaps the universe itself was once perfectly silent before it decided to sing. They debate whether God's first word broke some eternal hush. You half expect one of them to start levitating from sheer intellectual energy. At one point, Étienne says quietly, "Do you know what frightens me, Monsieur Desmarais? It's not that silence might not exist. It's that it might exist too much, that the universe is mostly made of it, and we just keep making noise so we don't notice." Julien nods slowly. "You're a poet, Monsieur Lenoir. You just hide behind gears." Étienne smiles. "And you're an engineer. You just hide behind words." They both laugh softly. For a moment, they look like two boys sharing a secret, rather than two men dissecting the soul of quiet. Outside, the day has turned gray. Rain begins to fall, a soft drizzle tapping against the window pane. Étienne glances toward it and mutters, "Even the sky can't stay quiet." Julien stands, smoothing his coat. "I'll leave you to your machines. I suspect they understand you better than I do." Étienne nods. "And you'll return?" "Perhaps," Julien says, heading to the door. "Or perhaps I'll wait for your clock to speak in silence first. When it does, call for me. Philosophers love paradoxes that work. When the door closes, the workshop feels different. Not quieter, just deeper. The kind of silence that follows meaningful words. Étienne stares at the brass heart again, half covered beneath its linen shroud. He lifts the cloth gently as though greeting an old friend. Then he whispers, "Let's try again." You watch him wind the spring with infinite care. The rain outside keeps its rhythm, slow, deliberate. Somewhere between the ticks of the surviving clocks, a faint pause appears, soft, fragile, but real. Maybe Julian was wrong. Maybe silence isn't absence. Maybe it's waiting. You lean back, feeling the quiet settle around you. Étienne doesn't notice. He's lost in his own storm of thought, sketching new designs. His pencil tapping softly, a heartbeat trying once again to measure what refuses to be held. Some historians still debate whether that conversation ever happened. But if it did, that day was the first time silence was treated not as emptiness, but as something alive. You keep standing beside Étienne's workbench, where tiny brass gears glimmer like drops of frozen sunlight. The air smells faintly of oil and candle smoke, a scent you're starting to recognize as the perfume of human patience. Étienne barely blinks as he leans over his notebook, scribbling symbols that look like musical notes tangled in a spiderweb. You can almost hear his thoughts ticking, quieter than any clock. He's trying to measure what no one else believes exists, the space between sound itself. He calls it les pulsations du silence, the pulses of stillness. Tonight, Paris hums beyond the window. Carriages clatter. The Seine mutters under the bridges, and the baker across the street is already slamming dough like a percussionist with a grudge. Yet inside this dim room, Étienne holds his breath and waits for that single moment when every vibration vanishes. He listens not to what is, but to what isn't. You can almost laugh. It's like a chef trying to weigh the flavor of nothing. He adjusts a tiny brass pendulum, then freezes. His quill trembles. "Do you hear that?" he whispers. You tilt your head, but there's only the faint creak of the floorboards. "Exactly," he says. "That's the interval I must record." Étienne's new experiment involves a curious cylinder of glass filled with mercury and an array of tuning forks that vibrate at different frequencies. Each fork represents a known sound: bells, footsteps, raindrops. Between them lies a void he marks as le zéro sonore, the zero of sound. He believes that silence has a rhythm, an invisible metronome hiding in the folds of reality. You watch as he winds a clock mechanism attached to the cylinder. It ticks, then halts, then ticks again, hesitating as though it too is uncertain whether to breathe. Étienne notes the durations between each hesitation, muttering about temporal elasticity. You start wondering if this man sleeps, eats, or if he just winds himself up every morning like one of his inventions. When dawn brushes pale gold through the shutters, he sighs and shows you a page of chaotic scribbles. "I found it," he murmurs, a pattern within the absence. You look and see lines that pulse like a heartbeat recorded on parchment. Except this heartbeat belongs to silence. He tries to explain. Every sound leaves a fading echo, and the gap between echoes isn't truly empty. It vibrates at frequencies below human hearing. He's certain that the quiet between a ticking clock and the next tick is not stillness at all, but a delicate hum that holds time together. "If we could hear it," he smiles, "we'd realize silence is the glue of the universe." You can't help but smile back, even as your brain quietly says, "That's not how glue works." By mid-morning, Étienne's table is littered with copper wires and bits of paper. He's sketching another device, one that might capture these invisible intervals. You imagine a glass bottle labeled Pure Silence, 1843 edition. Probably wouldn't sell well in a noisy Paris market. Still, something about his devotion makes you hush your sarcasm. There's an intimacy in his obsession, as if he's building a sanctuary for time itself. Later, a friend from the conservatoire visits, a composer named Julien. He laughs when he hears Étienne's theory. "You're telling me silence has tempo?" Étienne nods earnestly. "Every musician knows it," he insists. "We rest between notes. The rest is not nothing, it's anticipation." The two men argue in a rhythm of their own, voices rising and falling like a duet. You almost expect them to bow after the debate. That night, Étienne writes again. His handwriting grows tighter, the ink darker, as if the silence he seeks is consuming the space between letters. "The intervals are shrinking," he murmurs. "The quieter I listen, the shorter they become." He suspects there's a limit to perception, a border where silence and sound blur, like dawn fading into day. Perhaps silence isn't the absence of sound, he muses, but the sound of limits. You lean closer to the glass cylinder. Inside, tiny bubbles tremble as if reacting to vibrations too faint for your ears. Étienne measures the pulse with a mechanical lever. There, he says, pointing. See? The pause between ticks stretches when the air is colder. Silence expands with temperature. He chuckles softly. Even absence obeys physics. You joke, so if I turn down the thermostat, I'll get more silence for free. He actually laughs this time. A thin, weary laugh that ripples through the room like a whisper from a clock that forgot how to chime. As the hours slide by, you notice how the workshop itself begins to feel alive with these invisible beats. The ticking clocks on the walls seem to sync, then drift apart, then sync again. Between each sound is a strange awareness, like the whole space is breathing. Étienne notices too. It's contagious, he says softly. When you start listening for silence, you find it everywhere, even between your own thoughts. You don't tell him that sounds dangerously close to meditation. He'd probably design a gear system for that too. Outside, rain starts to fall. You hear the roof sigh under its weight. Étienne closes his eyes and listens. That's not rain, he says. That's punctuation. You tilt your head, he's right in a poetic way. The droplets mark time like commas in a sentence the city keeps rewriting. Later, when you help him adjust the pendulum, he explains how he times the space between raindrops hitting the same point on the sill. Each drop, he says, defines silence before the next. You realize he's transformed listening into a science, and yet it feels like worship, by candlelight. He builds a final edition, a small brass needle connected to the pendulum's pause, meant to trace the pattern of quiet onto soot-covered paper. When he tests it, the needle dances and halts, leaving faint scratches like constellations of stillness. Étienne Grain. There it is, he whispers, the shape of what we cannot hear. You stare at those fragile marks. They look random yet hypnotic. Somewhere within that trembling line, perhaps there is a hidden rhythm, the heartbeat of an unspoken world. He sets down his quill, exhausted but radiant. Tomorrow, he says, I'll show you how to make silence visible. His eyes glint like brass polished by candlelight. As you prepare to leave, you glance once more at the wall of clocks. Their ticking now feels softer, like the city itself has leaned in to listen. You wonder whether silence truly exists, or if it's just another melody waiting for someone stubborn enough to record it. You turn the doorknob, the metal cool against your palm. Behind you, Étienne whispers something that almost vanishes before reaching your ear. Time only moves because silence lets it. Outside, the rain has stopped. Paris hums again. But in your chest, there lingers a quiet rhythm, steady, unseen, impossibly real. The winter that year arrives like a slow exhale over Paris. Frost crawling across windows, breath turning into mist, and the city's heartbeat quieting beneath layers of snow. You can feel the cold before you even open Étienne's workshop door. It hums through the iron handle, through the hinges, through your bones. Inside, the air is thick with stillness, heavy as a secret. Étienne hasn't slept in days. His eyes are shadowed but bright, like candle flames refusing to die. The clocks on the walls tick unevenly, some racing, some dragging behind, as if each is arguing with time itself. And at the center of it all, on his worn oak table, stands the newest of his experiments. A pendulum of silver and glass, delicate as a breath caught mid-air. He calls it le cœur de l'hiver, the heart of winter. It's built to measure not seconds, but silences. You step closer. The pendulum swings with a precision that feels too human, almost shy in the way it pauses at the edges. Étienne adjusts a gear, whispers a number, then backs away to listen. Every sound in the room seems to bow before the machine. The groan of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind outside, even your own heartbeat, and then without warning, the pendulum stops. It freezes mid-arc, a glint of light suspended in the dark. For a moment you think the world itself has forgotten how to move. Étienne's breath catches. You hear absolutely nothing. No ticking, no wind, not even the faraway sound of a carriage wheel. Just absence. He closes his eyes and whispers, "There, that's it." You almost whisper back, afraid to disturb whatever fragile spell he's invoked. But curiosity wins. What just happened? Étienne's lips curve into the smallest smile. I think I heard silence. It sounds absurd. And yet you feel it too. This dense, luminous quiet, like the pause before an orchestra's first note. Even your thoughts sound muffled, as though wrapped in snow. Étienne steps toward the frozen pendulum. He examines it from every angle, then scribbles notes furiously. The mechanism is perfect, he murmurs, but time itself. Hesitated. You can't help it. You laugh softly. You broke time, congratulations. He glances up and for once laughs with you, a rare trembling laugh that fogs the cold air. But then he grows serious again. Don't you feel it? He asks. It's as if the universe inhaled and forgot to exhale. He believes that silence has weight, that it presses against the ears, against the walls, bending perception. You're tempted to tell him that maybe he's just exhausted. Instead, you stay quiet. There's something sacred about this hush, something you don't want to disturb with human logic. The candle beside him flickers, then steadies. Étienne leans close to the pendulum. I designed it to never stop, he murmurs. But perhaps it's listening. The night grows deeper. Snow taps gently at the window, then stops as though it too has noticed the absence of sound. You realize you can hear your own heartbeat again, slow, deliberate. The world is still turning, but softly, cautiously. Étienne records every second of the phenomenon. He marks the moment the pendulum froze, midnight exactly. Of course, he mutters, always midnight. The hour when time loses its footing. He tells you an old superstition, how monks in the Middle Ages claimed that at midnight, time rests for a fraction of a breath, so that angels can adjust the stars. Maybe, he says with a hint of mischief, this is what they meant. You think he's joking until you see the look in his eyes, part scientist, part believer. He begins another experiment, lighting a second candle and timing its flickers. The flame trembles but never goes out. Every light, he says, fights silence in its own way. You find yourself whispering too now, as if your voice might fracture the delicate calm. Even the crackle of the candle feels loud. Étienne moves carefully, almost reverently, around the table. You know, he says, in all my years as a clockmaker, I thought sound defined time. But now I think it's the stillness between. He places his palm above the frozen pendulum, not touching, just hovering, as if trying to feel the pulse of an invisible force. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the pendulum trembles ever so slightly and resumes its swing. You both exhale. The ticking returns, timid at first, then stronger. It's strange. After so much silence, the sound feels almost too alive, like an animal waking from hibernation. Étienne watches it with awe. See, he whispers. Even silence must end. You tease him. Good thing. Otherwise you'd have to invent a way to restart the universe. He chuckles. I would if I had the parts. The hours pass. The frost thickens on the window, shaping itself into ferns and feathers. Outside, the city sleeps beneath white rooftops. You imagine time itself bundled under blankets, dreaming quietly. Étienne finishes his notes. The duration of the stop, exactly 8 seconds, he murmurs. Long enough for awareness to flicker. He pauses, then adds, but I can't explain why it happened. You ask, maybe temperature or humidity. He shakes his head. No, something else. The pendulum didn't fail, it chose to stop. That sounds dangerously mystical, but you've learned better than to argue. Instead, you look at the pendulum again. Its swing seems different now, softer, more deliberate, almost human. As dawn approaches, the city begins to stir. A faraway bell tolls 1 o'clock, its echo swallowed by the snow. Étienne glances toward the window. Do you hear how the sound travels slower in winter? He asks. It's as if silence thickens in the cold. You nod. The world feels padded, insulated. Even the light entering the room seems to move cautiously, afraid to disturb what happened here. Étienne sits back, exhausted but radiant. I may have captured it, he says quietly. A measurable stillness. You smile, unsure if you believe him, but something inside you shifts. Maybe silence isn't emptiness at all. Maybe it's a heartbeat too slow for human ears. Before leaving, you glance once more at the pendulum. Its motion is steady again, patient, eternal. Yet part of you wonders if, at the next midnight, it will pause once more to let the universe breathe. As you step outside, the snow crunches beneath your feet, loud and startling. You realize how much noise the world truly makes, and how precious that 8-second void was. Somewhere behind you, through the frost and candlelight, Étienne whispers to himself, "Now I know what time sounds like when it listens." Paris always breathes in rhythm, with carriages clattering, wheels scraping cobblestones, vendors calling, bells echoing from far corners of the city. But that winter evening, something strange drifted through the streets. A rumor, soft as mist, spreading from one whisper to the next. They said a clockmaker on Rue de Gravilliers had built a device that could measure silence. And if you listened carefully, you could feel time stop. At first, it was just gossip passed between shopkeepers and night watchmen, the sort of thing Parisians love to embroider while sipping wine by candlelight. But rumors, like smoke, have a way of seeping under doors. By dawn, the entire neighborhood hummed with curiosity. Someone suggested that if Étienne's invention could capture stillness, then perhaps, just for one night, everyone should give it room to breathe, and so, almost without coordination, Paris did something it had never done before. It prepared to turn itself off. You walked through the narrow lanes that evening, bundled in your coat, your breath clouding in the icy air. The clocks in shop windows all point to different hours. They're ticking, faint but insistent. Somewhere a baker's clock chimes 7, but the sound fades almost instantly into the distance, as if embarrassed by its own noise. The streets are dimmer than usual. Candles flicker behind shutters. There's a sense of anticipation, like the entire city is waiting to exhale. They called it La Nuit sans horloge, the night without clocks. By 9 o'clock, families were standing before their mantel clocks, fingers hovering over winding keys. Watchmakers, amused and slightly offended, debated whether stopping time even for a moment could curse the machinery. And yet curiosity won. One by one, pendulums froze mid-swing. You can almost hear it on that moment when Paris forgets to tick. The wind sighs through alleyways. Cats dart across roofs. In the absence of bells and gears, another kind of music rises. The creak of wood, the faint rush of the Seine, the shuffle of feet on cobblestones. Without the tyranny of seconds, every sound seems to stretch, to linger longer than it should. A child giggles in an apartment courtyard. Someone hums a lullaby off-key. From the riverbank, you catch the faint rhythm of water tapping stone. The city, stripped of its mechanical pulse, reveals its heartbeat made of human things. In his workshop, Étienne Lenoir sits by the silent remains of his clocks. He hadn't asked for this. The citywide experiment was beyond his control, but part of him smiles at the thought. It's as if his private obsession has escaped the walls of his workshop and spilled into the world outside. He watches the frozen pendulum, the brass arm caught in eternal hesitation. On his table lies the half-finished chronomètre du silence, its glass face catching the candlelight. Étienne dips his quill and writes in his notebook. Tonight, time has paused and Paris breathes differently. Outside, you see neighbors speaking softer, as though the air itself is sacred. Even the dogs bark only once or twice before curling up again. Some say that in certain parts of the city, they could hear things they never noticed before. The hum of their own heartbeat, the faint vibration of candle flames, the flutter of a moth's wings against a window pane. It's funny, isn't it? We spend centuries building louder, faster ways to measure time. And yet, the first time we truly feel it is when everything stops. A street musician tries to play his violin but falters. Without rhythm to guide him, his bow stumbles in the stillness. A clock tower near the Sorbonne stands mute, its bell refusing to ring the hour. And yet the students below don't seem to mind. They lie on the cold stone steps, counting breaths instead of minutes. Midnight comes unnoticed. You pass by the Café de l'Horloge, ironic name tonight, and see the owner wiping down his counter in silence. He smiles faintly, gestures for you to listen. The usual clink of cups and laughter is gone. All that remains is the sound of the wooden door expanding in the cold, the faint crackle of the hearth. Feels like the city's sleeping, he whispers. In that hush, Étienne's small window glows softly. You imagine him tracing invisible patterns in the air, wondering if he's finally captured what he sought all these years. The still point between two sounds. But he knows better. True silence, he realizes, isn't absence. It's awareness. It's hearing everything that hides beneath the noise. There's a peculiar comfort in that thought. You stand outside, your gloved hand resting on the frosted glass, and you can almost feel the quiet pulsing beneath your skin. Historians later argued about that night, whether it truly happened, or if it was a romantic exaggeration that spread through the cafes decades later. Some records mention flickering lights over the Marais district, perhaps caused by gas lamps left unattended. Others note that city officials received complaints the following day about the eerie lack of bells. A few skeptical scholars insist it was no more than a poetic myth born from Étienne's reputation. But maybe myths are just truths that decided to whisper. When dawn finally creeps over the rooftops, the city stirs again. Windows open, shutters groan, roosters crow, and one by one the clocks return to life. Pendulums sway, gears catch, springs unwind. The first chime of the morning bell echoes down the street like a sigh of relief. People smile. Some swear the air feels lighter. Others confess they miss the silence already. A woman in the flower market says she never noticed how loud the pigeons were until now. And Étienne, he doesn't move for a long time. The candle has burned down to a stub, the wax pooling around the base like melted hours. His silent clock still stands motionless, yet he knows something has changed. He writes one last note. The city without clocks revealed a truth. That silence, once shared, becomes a language of its own. Then, as if in answer, a faint click echoes through the room. The frozen pendulum stirs, just once before settling again. Étienne laughs quietly. Maybe silence can be measured after all. You step away from the window, the cold morning brushing your cheeks. The city resumes its rhythm behind you. Trams rolling, bells calling, the usual chaos of life. But you keep hearing that faint echo of nothingness, the gap between two sounds that feels like eternity. And somewhere deep inside, you understand what Étienne tried to capture. Not the end of time, but the moment when time itself holds its breath. Morning light spills over Paris like warm milk over parchment, pale, quiet, and a little too bright after the hush of the night before. You wake to the faint ticking of clocks that dared to move again. The city hums cautiously, as though still remembering the silence it briefly held. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, bells ring almost shyly, as if testing whether they are still allowed to. In the small workshop on Rue de Gravilliers, Étienne Lenoir leans over his desk, his hands trembling slightly from lack of sleep. Before him lies a stack of parchment, smudged, dense, alive with sketches and calculations. The ink stains on his fingertips are black constellations of obsession. All night he'd been writing, recording, trying to understand what Paris had felt the night before. He writes, "The people heard what cannot be heard. Silence is not void, it is pattern." He pauses, letting the quill hover above the page. The air still feels tender, fragile. You can almost see thoughts flickering across his face like the movement of clouds. What if silence itself could be measured, quantified, and proven? What if the world's quiet moments had frequency and weight, as tangible as sound? And so he begins composing his letter. To the members of the Académie des Sciences, he writes carefully, his pen scratching softly. "I submit for your examination a device designed to measure temporal absence, a chronometer that captures silence as duration, not as vacancy." He stops to sip cold coffee, grimaces, then mutters to himself something about how philosophers get away with nonsense all the time. So perhaps scientists might indulge a little poetry too. The candle beside him flickers out, its smoke curling toward the ceiling like a fading question mark. For 3 days he refines the language. Every word must sound dignified but not mad, curious but not mystical. That balance is delicate. Too much wonder and they'll laugh, too much logic and they'll miss the magic entirely. When at last the letter is sealed with wax, Étienne tucks it inside his coat. Outside, the city has returned to its old tempo. Wheels rattle, shop signs squeak. Someone somewhere is already late for lunch. You follow him down the narrow streets past the perfume of fresh bread and the metallic tang of rain in the gutters. The academy sits on the left bank, stately and austere like a cathedral for reason. Its doors are guarded not by faith but by skepticism. Étienne hesitates before entering. He looks small against the marble facade, like a man about to measure the wind. Inside, a clerk takes the envelope with professional indifference, stamping it with the seal of submission. No one looks up when he says softly, "It concerns the nature of silence." A pause, then a dry chuckle from the next desk. "Monsieur, silence needs no study. We have enough of it at our meetings." Étienne forces a polite smile, bows and leaves. The sound of his boots against the marble corridor echoes much too loudly. Days turn into weeks. The waiting gnaws at him. Every morning he opens his window to listen, not to the clocks but to the spaces between them. He measures in his notes how long the quiet lasts before a carriage passes, how the rhythm of rain interrupts itself, how sometimes the city seems to breathe between two heartbeats, but no letter arrives. By the second month, he begins to suspect the Academy has simply ignored him. He imagines the scientists there reading his proposal aloud over coffee, smirking behind their spectacles. A man trying to measure silence, one might say. Next, perhaps he'll weigh shadows. A friend at the post office, pitying his persistence, eventually shows him a note returned from the Académie. Monsieur Lenoir's work, while imaginative, does not constitute measurable science. Silence, being the absence of sound, cannot be quantified. We recommend his energies be redirected toward practical horology. It's the kind of rejection that sounds polite, but feels like a door closing softly on your hand. That night, Étienne sits in the workshop, the rejected letter crumpled beside him. You can hear the faint groan of gears turning overhead, the whisper of pendulums resuming their endless dialogue. Yet in that clutter of motion, his heart feels painfully still. He begins speaking aloud, not to anyone in particular, maybe to you, maybe to the clocks. They say silence cannot be measured, but what if it measures us? What if what we call quiet is just the moment the world stops answering back? You watch his reflection in the clock glass, his eyes bright, haunted. He picks up his pen again, scribbles furiously. If sound is presence, he murmurs, then silence is memory. A faint laugh escapes him, weary, almost a sigh. But of course they will not print that in the journals. It's a strange comfort, the stubbornness of dreamers. You recognize it, that part of every creator who keeps talking to the void, even when the void sends back form letters of refusal. By morning, Étienne hasn't slept. He reads the rejection again, this time tracing the words as though they were coordinates leading somewhere else. Absence cannot be quantified, it says, and suddenly that sentence feels like a challenge instead of a verdict. He begins sketching new diagrams, devices that use vibration rather than sound, light rather than tick. The idea evolves in strange, beautiful directions. What if silence could cast a shadow? What if each pause in sound was a vibration we couldn't hear, but still lived inside? Outside, church bells ring, filling the air with their familiar iron voices. Étienne flanche. The noise feels different now, invasive, almost cruel. For the first time, he covers his ears and realizes how exhausting the world has become, and you, standing there beside him in imagination, can't help but think of how we still do it. Drown our days in noise, fill every pause with motion, every silence with a scroll, a screen, a sound. Maybe we're all still afraid of what Étienne was trying to listen to, he writes again in his notebook. Perhaps they are right. Silence cannot be measured by their instruments, but maybe it can be heard by the soul. The ink trembles on the paper as he closes the book. Historians still argue about that letter, whether it truly existed, or whether the rejection was apocryphal, passed down as folklore among clockmakers. Some say the Academy later denied ever receiving such a submission. Others claim a copy survives in a private collection, though no one has verified its authenticity. But you imagine Étienne that morning, tired, unshaven, yet smiling faintly as the light crawls back into his room. The failure does not defeat him. It redirects him, because sometimes the only way to prove an impossible idea is to build it anyway. And as he begins tinkering once more, winding a gear, tightening a spring, you can feel something quietly shift in the air. That electric hum before discovery, that breath before the world learns to listen again. The rain has not stopped for 3 days. It drums against the tiled roof of Étienne's workshop, soft but relentless. 1,000 tiny percussionists rehearsing the same rhythm. Outside, Paris hides under a grey veil, and even the pigeons look tired of their own cooing. You step inside again, brushing droplets off your coat. And for the first time, you notice something uncanny. The church bell across the street is silent. It's supposed to ring every hour, a habit as old as the square itself. Yet now there's nothing, not even the faintest echo of its bronze voice. Étienne looks up from his bench, eyes rimmed red, as though he's been listening for something that refuses to arrive. "It's strange, isn't it?" he whispers. The city feels unanchored. You nod and the two of you stand there, surrounded by clocks that tick faintly, some fast, some slow, some seeming to skip entire breaths. Outside, the silence spreads, not the comforting kind, but the hollow one that follows after something stops moving. Étienne closes his eyes. A bell that will not ring, he murmurs, is like time holding its breath. He's not wrong. Bells have always been the lungs of a city. From medieval monasteries to royal courts, they kept the rhythm of life. The first mechanical clocks, centuries before Étienne, were built simply to strike bells with more precision. Noise was proof of order. So when the church's bronze mouth went quiet, it wasn't just an accident. It felt like a fracture in the world's heartbeat. A parish boy had come running earlier, soaked and pale, shouting that lightning struck the tower during last night's storm. The mechanism melted, the clapper wedged in midair. The priest declared it an omen, though in true Parisian fashion he still charged tourists to see the damage. Étienne only smiled at that, a thin line of amusement flickering beneath exhaustion. Perhaps heaven grew tired of being on schedule, he said. You can't help but laugh, the soft, stifled kind you give when you're not sure you should. Maybe heaven forgot to wind itself, you suggest. Étienne chuckles, the sound dry and fleeting. Or perhaps, he says, it simply wished to listen. And so that evening the entire quarter of Saint-Antoine falls under a strange enchantment. The absence of the bell leaves a gap, and in that gap other sounds appear. The creak of shutters, the flutter of laundry lines, a cat sneezing near the bakery, a carriage wheel sloshing through puddles. Everything small becomes loud when the great voices rest. Étienne moves to the window, pressing his palm to the cold glass. Do you feel it? He asks quietly. The weight of what's missing. You do. It feels like standing in a cathedral after everyone has gone home. The air itself holds its breath. Some historians still debate whether this moment truly happened, whether the silence of the Saint-Antoine bell was just coincidence, or whether Étienne's own experiments had somehow interfered with the metal's resonance. He had been testing devices that read vibration patterns in sound, thin membranes stretched across brass chambers. Perhaps some scholars argue he altered the bell's frequency without knowing. Others dismiss it as superstition. But whatever the truth, that week the silence deepened, and in that deepening something shifted in Étienne. You see it in the way he moves, slower, softer, like someone afraid of waking a sleeping giant. He no longer measures time with ticking. He measures it by pauses, the gap between thunder and echo, between a sigh and the next inhale. Noise distracts us, he says one evening, as you share tea gone lukewarm. But silence. Silence reveals how fragile we are. Without sound, there's only ourselves left to hear. He pours more tea and misses the cup by a second, spilling amber liquid across his sketches. You both laugh. Guess silence doesn't make me any more precise, he mutters. You hand him a cloth. Maybe precision's overrated, you reply. Imagine if life always ticked perfectly. You'd never know you were alive, just accurate. He grins at that, a rare thing these days. That's something only a poet would say, he murmurs. Or a fool. You shrug. Maybe both. I'm just trying to keep up with a man who wants to measure nothing. Rain thickens again, and thunder murmurs like a tired god. The entire city listens. Streets that once echoed with carriage wheels now hum faintly with stillness. The silence feels alive, stretching, breathing, almost warm. People step outside their windows, curious, as if expecting some grand announcement from the heavens. But all they get is the absence of sound. That's when Étienne decides to walk to the church. You follow him, umbrella trembling under the rain. The tower looms above, its bell blackened from the lightning strike, its ropes limp like the veins of a sleeping titan. Étienne removes his hat. So, he whispers to the bronze, you've stopped speaking. He looks almost tender, like a doctor visiting an old patient. He takes out a small tuning fork from his coat pocket, one of his prototypes, and strikes it gently against the stone. The note shivers in the air, bright and trembling, then fades. The bell remains silent. No resonance, Étienne says, no echo. It's as if the air refuses to carry sound. The priest watches from the doorway, unimpressed. Perhaps God prefers quiet, he says. Étienne nods slowly. Perhaps, he answers, or perhaps he's waiting to hear what we do with it. That night, when you return to the workshop, something extraordinary happens. The clocks, hundreds of them from wrist-size to wall-high, begin to slow almost in unison. Their ticks no longer overlap chaotically. Instead, they pulse together, like a single enormous heartbeat echoing through wood and brass. For the first time, the noise feels calm. Étienne listens, eyes wide. "They've synchronized," he whispers. "Not by sound, but by silence." The phrase hangs between you, heavy and impossible. You remember the philosopher's words from months ago, how silence might not be emptiness, but the space where everything meets. Étienne looks at you and nods as if hearing your thought. "Maybe," he says. The bell's refusal to ring was a signal, a reminder that even stillness carries rhythm. You both stay up late, not speaking, letting the rain and the muted ticking blend into something wordless. For a fleeting moment, the line between sound and absence disappears. By dawn, the first light creeps through the windows. The storm has passed. From across the city, you hear the faint call of another church bell, distant but alive. Étienne smiles, weary but content. "Paris is waking," he says softly. "It has learned to listen." You don't answer. You just watch him, hands trembling slightly as he adjusts a clock that no longer needs winding. The air in the workshop hums faintly, like a secret too shy to reveal itself. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, the silent bell of Saint-Antoine still waits, motionless, patient, perhaps eternal. And in its stillness, Étienne finds his clearest measurement yet. Time, after all, isn't just what moves, it's also what pauses. You exhale, realizing that in this city that once never slept, silence has finally spoken louder than all the bells combined. The storm has left behind a fragile kind of quiet, the sort that doesn't quite trust itself yet. You can still smell the wet iron of the city, rainwater mixed with soot, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of soaked cobblestones. Inside the workshop, Étienne moves slowly, almost reverently, as though afraid that one wrong motion might startle the silence away. He has begun sketching again. His quill scratches faintly against the paper, the only surviving rhythm in the room. On the page, strange diagrams bloom, spirals within spirals, crescents labeled intervals of nothing, arrows pointing toward blank spaces he calls zones of rest. You don't understand half of it, but even in your confusion, you feel the quiet humming beneath each line, as if the drawings themselves are holding their breath. "You see," Étienne says softly, "we've measured every sound, bells, pendulums, even the whisper of a moth's wings when it brushes glass. But what about what isn't there?" He taps the quill against the table, leaving an accidental ink mark that looks like a tiny eclipse. "Absence has weight too. We just don't have the right instrument to feel it." You lean closer, watching the gears and springs scattered across the bench. Some are polished to a mirror shine, others stained with soot. "So you're building a machine to record nothing?" you ask, half teasing, half in awe. Étienne's eyes gleam with that familiar, fevered light. "Not nothing," he corrects gently. "The sound of absence, what lingers between two ticks. The space that carries all we fail to hear." You can't help but smile. "Sounds like the world's most expensive nap timer." He laughs, a sound so rare lately that it startles both of you. "Maybe it is," he admits, "but at least it will be the most precise nap timer in Paris." Days pass as he works. You help where you can, holding a lamp steady, turning screws, fetching oil or bread from the corner bakery. Each evening, the workshop fills with the faint metallic perfume of brass dust and lavender polish. Outside, Paris hums faintly, its noise reduced to a distant pulse. The silent bell of Saint-Antoine remains frozen in its tower, as if guarding whatever secret Étienne is trying to coax from the air. His new invention looks nothing like a clock. It resembles a hybrid between an organ and a telescope, a curved brass body with glass chambers at its heart, inside which thin membranes stretch like soap bubbles. Tiny needles, delicate as eyelashes, hover just above them. Étienne calls it le chronophone de silence, the time sound of stillness. One evening, as you adjust the wick on the oil lamp, Étienne gestures for you to listen. He winds a small spring, and the device exhales a whisper. The membranes tremble, catching vibrations invisible to you. The needles quiver, then trace thin silver lines across a roll of smoked paper. When it stops, Étienne holds up the paper proudly. It's blank. You raise an eyebrow. "So, it worked perfectly." He grins, unbothered. "Exactly." No noise at all. That's what success looks like. There's something quietly miraculous in his conviction. Most inventors would despair at a result like that, but Étienne sees beauty in absence, in what refuses to appear. "Listen again," he says. He resets the device, adjusts a valve, and you notice a faint vibration in the air, like the memory of a sound rather than the sound itself, and then you hear it. Not with your ears, but somewhere deeper. A pressure, a pulse, the echo of space folding inward. It lasts less than a second, but it leaves behind an ache as though the room itself just sighed. Étienne's face softens. That, he whispers, is what's between. For a while, neither of you speak. The rain has returned, gentle this time, tapping against the glass in sync with the faint movement of his device. You realize how alive silence truly is, how it shimmers and shifts like wind through cloth. Étienne begins recording these invisible pulses, marking each with notes that look more like poetry than science. 2:17 a.m. Slight murmur between thunder and echo. 4:02. Hum of nothingness, felt in the spine. Some historians would later debate whether these entries were real measurements or fragments of a restless mind. A few claimed the chronophone could indeed detect subsonic vibrations, frequencies below human hearing. Others dismissed it as a romantic delusion, an elaborate metaphor disguised as machinery. But in that workshop, as you watch Étienne work, there's no question of madness, only devotion. You ask him one night if he ever fears that silence might not want to be captured. Étienne smiles faintly. Perhaps it doesn't. But isn't it our nature to chase what retreats? Artists chase beauty. Sailors chase horizons. I simply chase quiet. His words settle in your chest like dust on old velvet. You think of how every great discovery begins as a pursuit of the impossible, of light, of flight, of sound. Maybe measuring silence is just another kind of flight, one that leaves no trace behind. Later, as candles burn low, Étienne shows you a peculiar observation. When the chronophone records, nearby clocks slow down by a fraction of a second. It's as if, he says, the air hesitates. He laughs softly. Maybe the universe holds its breath while listening. The image lingers with you through the night. The idea of the cosmos pausing, leaning in to catch a whisper of itself. You imagine stars flickering a heartbeat slower, raindrops hovering midfall, the city's noise dimming just enough for eternity to peek through. You try the machine yourself the next day, while Étienne sleeps at his desk, exhausted. You wind it, hold your breath, and let it run. Again, no sound, only that trembling in your bones. When you unroll the paper, there's the faintest, almost imperceptible line curved like the horizon. For a moment you could swear it moves. Étienne wakes to find you staring. It answered you, he says, half asleep. Silence always does if you're patient enough. Outside, dawn begins to break, gilding the rooftops in soft gold. The city stirs. Footsteps, doors, a street vendor's first call, and the world resumes its restless hum. But something in you has changed. You now hear the spaces between things, the half-second pause before laughter, the air between words, the breath before confession. Étienne places the chronophone on a shelf, hands trembling from fatigue. We'll need to refine it, he murmurs, but we've proven something. Silence is not emptiness. It's the frame that holds everything in place. You glance at the paper again, that almost invisible line glinting in the light. It feels alive. A quiet heartbeat running parallel to the world, and for the first time you understand why Étienne smiles when he listens to nothing. Because in that nothing he has found the purest form of time, the moment when the universe forgets to move and simply is. You close your eyes, breathing with it. The workshop hums faintly. The line on the paper fades, and somewhere deep within the quiet, time itself seems to fall asleep. You remember the faint smell of brass and candle smoke that used to fill Étienne's workshop. It lingers in your imagination even now, like an aroma that refuses to fade from the memory of the walls. After the storm that silenced the city, the old clockmaker had changed. You can sense it in the way his hands trembled, not from age, but from a strange awareness, as though he had touched something that mortals were never meant to measure. For weeks, Étienne barely left his bench. His apprentice, a quiet boy named Luc, would sometimes peek through the cracked door, only to find the master staring at a single page in his notebook, whispering equations to himself. Sometimes he laughed softly, other times he wept. You might think he was losing his mind, but in truth, he was losing something far rarer, his boundaries between sound and silence. That notebook, its leather cover worn thin, corners darkened by oil and fingerprints, became his entire world. It contained the sketches of mechanisms no one had ever built, drawings of cogs with impossible shapes, and cryptic notes about intervals that breathe. Étienne called it le cahier du silence, the notebook of silence. He believed it held the final key to what he had sought all along, the ability to make time visible even when it was utterly still. The margins were filled with tiny observations, how long the echo of a pendulum's last swing lingered, how air vibrated after the final tick. One entry simply read, "Perhaps silence is not the absence of time, but its deepest pulse." It's the sort of line you might find on a Tumblr post now, set in italics over a soft photo of rain on glass. But back then, it was the kind of idea that could ruin a man's reputation. Rumors began to swirl among Parisian horologists. Étienne Lenoir, once a respected clockmaker, had gone mad with quiet. Some said he'd been cursed by his own invention. Others whispered that he'd found a way to stop time altogether, and that he'd hidden it in his notebook so no one else could unleash it. The last recorded sighting of Étienne was on a fog-drenched morning in 1861. Luc found him standing at the banks of the Seine, staring at the water's surface as if it were a mirror for eternity. The notebook was tucked beneath his arm. He turned to Luc and said, "Every clock ends where silence begins." Then he walked away, back toward his workshop, and was never seen again. When neighbors finally broke down the door days later, the room was immaculate. Not a single tool was out of place. The clocks had all stopped at exactly the same time, 12 minutes past 2. On the workbench sat a small brass box, sealed shut with a hinge so intricate that even other clockmakers couldn't open it without breaking the mechanism. And of course the notebook was gone. You feel a chill imagining that room frozen in stillness, the light from the window barely daring to move, dust motes hovering like suspended seconds. If you listen closely, maybe you'd hear the last breath of the clockmaker, hanging there, waiting for someone to notice. Over the decades, collectors, historians, and treasure hunters searched obsessively for le cahier du silence. Some claim to have found fragments, a page describing an escapement that runs on absence, another with diagrams that looked eerily like modern soundwave graphs. A few forgers even tried to sell fake pages at antique markets, claiming they came from Étienne's workshop. But the most persistent legend came from a letter discovered in the 1890s. It was written by Luc, now an old man, and sent to a Parisian museum curator. The letter said simply, "The notebook is safe inside the heart that never beat." That phrase ignited a century of obsession. The heart that never beat was thought to refer to one of Étienne's unfinished timepieces, the silent clock with a brass core that had failed years earlier. Historians still debate whether Luc's words were metaphorical or literal. Some believe he hid the notebook inside that very clock, sealing it away so no one could disturb the silence Étienne discovered. You imagine scholars in dusty archives arguing over faded sketches and looping handwriting, each convinced they've decoded the truth. There's always one professor in tweed insisting, "It's a metaphor," while another waves a magnifying glass like a weapon, hissing, "No, he meant an actual heart." The debate has never really ended. In the 20th century, when Paris rebuilt itself into a modern hum, the myth resurfaced. During restoration work in Montmartre, a hidden compartment was found beneath a clockmaker's floorboards. Inside, a small box filled with corroded brass parts and one brittle scrap of parchment. The writing was nearly illegible, but one sentence survived. "Silence can be recorded only by what dares not sound." It could have been Étienne's handwriting, or just an apprentice's note. No one knows. Historians still argue about it at conferences, where the coffee is bad and the Wi-Fi worse. Even today, the supposed notebook of silence continues to haunt horologists and dreamers alike. You can find online forums, modern digital catacombs, where enthusiasts swap photos of old gears and debate whether Étienne's design predicted acoustic dampening technology or even early soundwave theory. One post reads, "Maybe the clockmaker didn't measure silence, maybe he created it." You can't help but smile at that idea. The notion that somewhere centuries later, a quiet craftsman's dream could ripple through time and reach you, sitting there, listening to this story in the dark. Maybe that's the real legacy of the lost notebook, not a physical object, but a contagious wonder passed from one curious soul to another. You picture it, a small, weathered book resting in the hollow of an unfinished clock, the gears surrounding it like ribs around a sleeping heart. Dust gathers over the decades, muffling even the air, and in that stillness, silence hums softly, not empty but alive. Maybe one day someone will open that clock, or maybe it's better if no one ever does. After all, some mysteries are meant to stay in between the ticks, half heard, half felt, where imagination fills the gaps that time leaves behind. And as you breathe out, you notice how your room has grown quieter. The hum of your fan feels like the pulse of a faraway mechanism, echoing Étienne's world. You realize that silence was never about the absence of sound. It's about noticing what remains when everything else fades. Some say the notebook was real. Others believe it was just a metaphor for peace, for surrender, for the rare art of listening. But the truth, as always, lies somewhere between. The historians still debate the facts, of course, they always will. But if you close your eyes, you might almost hear the faint scratch of Étienne's quill, tracing another impossible idea into the parchment. And for a moment, you can swear that the room around you pauses, just one heartbeat too long. Decades pass, then centuries turn quietly. Like the slow rotation of a clock's hidden wheel, Paris changes her skin, old stone replaced by glass, the hum of carriages yielding to the roar of engines, then the whisper of electric trams. Yet somewhere in the Musée des Arts et Métiers, under soft yellow light and the careful hush of polished corridors, there rests a small brass clock that refuses to make a sound. You find yourself standing before it now. Its label simply reads, Horloge silencieuse, circa 1850, maker unknown. The curator doesn't mention Étienne Lenoir. To them, it's just another curiosity among 1,000 forgotten inventions. But you know better. You recognize the delicate curvature of the casing, the hand-engraved initials, barely visible under tarnish, forming an EL that time itself tried to erase. It doesn't tick. It doesn't hum. It doesn't even seem to breathe. And yet, if you lean close enough, you might swear it's listening. Some say the museum acquired it after an estate sale in 1923. Others insist it was found sealed in a crate beneath a collapsed workshop wall in Montreuil. The paperwork vanished during the war, and no one can trace exactly where it came from. As always, the historians still debate the details, whether it truly belonged to the lost clockmaker who measured silence, or whether it's simply a legend wrapped in metal. Still, there's something about this object that unsettles and soothes in equal measure. The staff notice strange things. Security guards claim that every night, around 2 minutes past midnight, the other clocks in the room slow down just slightly, as if bowing to an invisible conductor. One technician swears he felt a vibration through the floor, a faint, steady rhythm, not quite sound, not quite movement. He said it felt like time breathing in. When experts opened the clock to inspect its mechanism, they found nothing ordinary. No spring, no escapement, no pendulum. Just a series of nested chambers, each smaller than the last, each designed to contain not movement but absence. One chamber, the deepest one, was entirely empty except for a tiny residue of graphite, as if something once written there had turned to dust. You can imagine Étienne's handwriting disappearing grain by grain, the words eroding until silence devoured even the ink. Perhaps the notebook truly did end up inside this heart of brass. Perhaps Luc, his faithful apprentice, fulfilled his promise to hide it, inside the heart that never beat. Or perhaps the clock is nothing more than a beautifully crafted riddle, a prank played by history on the curious. Still, you can't shake the feeling that the clock is aware of your attention. The air near it feels different, thicker, almost tender, like the moment before you fall asleep. You watch its glass face reflecting your own eyes, and for an instant, you think you see a flicker of movement inside, a shadow passing where no gear should move. Then it's gone. Modern engineers have tried everything: X-rays, microscans, acoustic mapping. Each attempt reveals something stranger. When they project sound waves into the clock's core, the echoes return inverted, as if silence itself is bouncing back. Some recordings even contain faint harmonic tones, almost like a heartbeat. One researcher, unnerved, deleted the files and refused to speak of them again. Of course, the rationalists have their theories. They say the clock is simply built with resonant metal. The illusions come from the acoustics of the glass dome, but the rest of us, those who've stood before it alone, late in the evening when the museum lights dim, We know that explanation feels too small. You picture the curator doing their nightly round, the wooden floors creaking softly. They pause near the silent clock, check the label, then move on. But once they leave, the air shifts again. The temperature drops slightly, the shadows stretch longer, and in that fragile stillness, there's a subtle shimmer, as if the boundary between now and then has thinned. Maybe the clock isn't measuring time at all. Maybe it's holding it, compressing centuries of quiet into one continuous breath. In 2007, a visiting sound artist named Camille Beaulieu was granted permission to study the piece after hours. She placed tiny microphones around it, hoping to capture the sound of nothing. What she recorded instead was a low-frequency hum, barely audible but perfectly rhythmic, 32 pulses per minute. The same number of beats per minute as a human heart during deep sleep. She released her findings at a conference, and of course academics scoffed. Coincidence, they said, a trick of the instruments. But her recording, which she titled Le Cœur du Silence, still circulates online. Listeners claim that if you play it long enough, you start to feel calm, almost too calm, like you're being rocked gently in invisible hands. You can't help but think that Étienne would have smiled at that. His dream to let silence itself speak found its way into a modern world that's louder than he could ever imagine. Airplanes, phones, sirens, and yet this small mute clock still whispers through time, reminding anyone who pauses to listen that even noise has a shadow. A small plaque beneath the display quotes an anonymous note discovered inside the museum archives decades ago. If you listen long enough, you'll hear what was never said. No one knows who wrote it. Some claim it was added by a curator with a poetic streak. Others believe it was copied from one of Étienne's lost letters. Either way, it fits perfectly. Because the truth of this clock, like the truth of silence, isn't something you can prove. It's something you feel in your bones, in that hush between one heartbeat and the next. You linger a bit longer before moving on, unwilling to break the moment. The other visitors chatter in distant halls, their voices bouncing like stray marbles on tile. But here, in this corner of the museum, sound seems to dissolve. It's as if the air itself remembers Étienne's workshop, the smell of oil and brass, the candlelight flickering on his weary hands, the final sigh before everything stopped, and somewhere deep inside the mechanism, whether real or imagined, a pulse continues. Not loud, not soft, simply present. A reminder that silence was never empty, only waiting. You step back, your reflection shrinking in the glass until the clock becomes a small golden blur in the distance. Then, for just one impossible instant, you think you hear a faint tick. A single note, precise and solitary. Or maybe it's just your own heartbeat, syncing with the quiet machine across time. You stay there a while longer, long enough for the museum walls to fade, long enough for the hum of the city to thin into nothing but breath and pulse. The last tick you remember hearing belongs to no clock at all. It's just the soft rhythm inside your chest, measured in warmth, not seconds. Somewhere deep in that quiet, you sense Étienne again. Not the man bent over brass gears and trembling springs, but the gentler shadow of him, the one who found in stillness what others chased in motion. You imagine him beside you, polishing the glass of his final creation, whispering the same thing he once scribbled in his lost notebook. Silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of listening. Outside, Paris might still be buzzing, trains sighing along their tracks, the river murmuring beneath bridges, but from where you sit, all that noise feels centuries away. Even the wind holds its breath for a moment, as if the world has leaned in to hear what silence might say next. You realize then that Étienne was never trying to build a perfect clock. He was trying to build a perfect pause. Your mind drifts through the pieces of his life like scattered gears, the frozen pendulum, the philosopher's questions, the city that once turned off its clocks. Each fragment catches the faintest glint of gold, like the edge of a dream that refuses to dim. Historians still argue, of course they do, about whether the quiet clock in the museum ever truly worked. Some claim it's just a clever mechanical illusion, that its gears move so smoothly, the ear mistakes precision for silence. Others believe it's powered by something far stranger, a resonance between the metal and the listener, a calibration of human calm. But as you stand before the glass case, you don't care which version is true. The stillness that settles over you feels too real, too heavy to be imagined. It wraps around your shoulders like a soft coat, like the muffled air before snow. And you can't help but think that maybe silence isn't something you measure with instruments, but something that measures you. You take a slow breath, letting your heartbeat sync with that invisible rhythm Étienne once called the pulse of quiet. Every exhale makes the room seem larger, emptier, almost holy. You picture him recording this moment in his notebook, line after line of your breathing, your stillness, the faint electric hum of thought. He would have loved that, to prove that silence could have shape, that absence could hum, and now the story folds gently inward. The museum fades into a dim workshop again. You can smell the oil, the iron filings, the faint sweetness of dust warmed by candlelight. Étienne's tools are scattered across the table, waiting for hands that will never return. The clock, the quiet one, rests at the center like a sleeping animal. Its hands point nowhere. Time has curled up inside it, content to rest. You reach out. Not to touch, just to feel the air vibrating around it. There's nothing to hear, but everything to sense. This silence has texture, fine as powder, soft as worn paper. It hums at the edge of perception, the way a memory hums before you remember it. And somewhere deep inside that hum, you swear you hear your own name, carried not by sound, but by stillness. It occurs to you that silence is not an emptiness at all, but a language, one that says you've arrived. You can stop listening for the next thing. This is it. Étienne might smile at that. After all, wasn't this the point? Not to escape time, but to make peace with it. The silent clock was never meant to erase the ticking world. It was meant to remind you that between each tick, between each breath, there's a small eternity, one only you can feel. You think of the night he first froze the pendulum, the hush that filled his lungs like revelation. Maybe this was where he ended too, not in despair but in surrender, letting silence speak where his voice could not, letting time rest where his hands had always wound it forward, and now you let yourself rest too. Outside, a single car passes. Somewhere a neighbor closes a window. The noises are faint, far away, background brushstrokes behind the still life of your room. You realize that modern life hums exactly the way Étienne feared it would, and yet you've managed to find a pocket of quiet anyway. That's the funny thing about silence. It doesn't need the world to hush. It only needs you to listen. You close your eyes. The quiet clock continues, though no one hears it. Maybe it's ticking in reverse now, counting down to dreams instead of dawn. Or maybe it's standing perfectly still, waiting for you to drift past it. Either way, you can feel yourself moving, slowly, gently, through the last corridor of the story. If Étienne were here, he might tell you that you finally understood what he spent his life trying to measure. That silence isn't the space between moments. It is the moment. It's time's softer self, the one that doesn't rush or fade, the one that holds you the way darkness holds starlight. So you breathe in once more as deeply as you can. The air tastes old and kind, like paper and candle smoke. When you exhale, the room exhales with you. The gears stop turning, the story stops speaking, and what's left, pure, delicate, shimmering, is quiet. Let it settle around you. Let it find your pulse and make it slow. The silence Étienne measured has found its home in you now. And for tonight at least, time has nothing more to say. End of script. Sweet dreams.